Yes, I will share my
Great.
screen shortly. All right. Well, thanks a lot for the invitation. It's great to be here. And yes, so with my colleague and co-author Fuad, we'll try to give you kind of a little summary about this return of the policy that shall not be named. So let me start with the quote from an important paper by the late Robert Lucas. I mean, he wrote many important papers, but perhaps this one is the most relevant for the topic of today. So basically says that if we know what an economic miracle is, we ought to be able to make one. So I guess the idea is, what are these economic miracles, and what are the factors that led to these achievements? So one of the reasons that industrial policy kind of was not the main topic of study, let's say for the last 2, 3 debates, at least within mainstream economics, is that, well, the economic miracles are pretty much outliers. So if you believe, like some physicists, that, well, the world is actually driven by the tail, you would pay attention to these miracles, namely the Asian miracles. And what we did basically with Fuad, we tried to learn from these Asian miracles. We're not the first one. There's been a lot of work on them, but we try to kind of to distill simple principles based on their experience. So what are these principles, right? And what is this tip we're giving for growth? And yeah, we call this true industrial policy, which is actually a technology and innovation policy. So in this graph, what we're showing is basically the extent of this miracle, no? Just to illustrate what these countries managed to achieve, over within a generation. So this is the GDP per capita of Korea in PPP term, purchasing power parity, so that we can compare across countries. And this is their GDP per capita between 1960 and 2020 in comparison to that of Malaysia, Chile, and Ghana. And you can see what's very important about this graph is that in the early 60s, actually, Ghana had a GDP per capita that was up to the mid 60s and even late 60s, GDP per capita that was actually higher than Korea. So in terms of starting point, these four economies start at relatively similar points. And then something happens around the 60s, 70s, I guess, with the arrival of Park Chung-hee and a complete reorientation of Korean policy, economic policy, and you see this start of divergence. So yes, Malaysia and Chile had relatively good growth, especially compared to Ghana, which has been stagnating. But you can see that in comparison, Korea really takes off, right? Especially in the mid-80s, and then they keep growing fast, and actually really fast. So if you take kind of a larger picture, just to show you kind of how, quote unquote, miraculous is the growth of Korea and other countries that we call the Asian miracles. So if you look at this graph, this figure, what you see on the x-axis is basically the GDP per capita of countries as a ratio of the US GDP per capita, so kind of relative income. And then what you have on the y-axis, so this is the x-axis, is the horizontal axis, is the relative income in 1970. And then on the y-axis, you have the same, the relative income, but this time in 2019. So this kind of summarizes the achievements or lack of achievements in terms of development for a large set of countries. And the quadrants basically represents income brackets. So if you are between 0 and 0.2, which is 20% of the GDP per capita of 1970, I mean, we consider these economies as being either low income up to basically lower middle income. Between 20% and 50%, this would be the upper middle income, and then above 50% of US GDP per capita, you'd be basically a high income country. Now, what you see, so basically the lower left quadrant where you have these countries clumped there, this is a big number of countries that were basically either low income or lower middle income and remained there. And then countries that basically above this 45-degree line, are the countries that manage to first grow, right, in relative term, but then if they make it to the next kind of quadrant, it means that they changed basically their income category. And you see that very few countries made it all the way from lower middle income all the way to high income. And you can see actually Korea there, almost 70%. Singapore is not, is based literally off the chart because they have a relative income that's actually bigger than one in 2019. So basically the idea is that very few countries made it. And what's the reason behind that is basically if you look at the advice of the standard economic advice or wisdom in the last decade, you can call it the standard policy prescription, right? So this includes things like macroeconomic stability, minimum state intervention, and enabling environment. So the idea is to spur, encourage investment in both physical and human capital. In other words, this standard approach or standard recipe for growth consists in tackling, what, for example, Daniel Roderick calls government failures. Now, what we did with Fuad in earlier work, what you see here is some advertisement for a book we edited with Minju called Breaking the Oil Spell, is that we use the countries of the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council, as a type of laboratory, right, to emphasize the role of this standard policy. And then what we note in our work is that actually these countries, they had large oil endowments, but they used them to basically tackle most of these government failures. If you look at variables or dimensions such that, tax rates, quality of infrastructure, they're doing really well. They're comparable to advanced countries. Capital accounts are open. There are a lot of implicit kind of subsidies for, electricity and so on. And more important, the labor market is pretty much open. So you can hire the most skilled or also the cheapest labor. And yet, what we note in our work is that in terms of productivity and relative growth, they didn't do as well. So in other words, what we're claiming is that, which is an old idea, and I mean, we know it in economics that, things like externalities matter, is that focusing only on the standard policy prescriptions may not be sufficient to create sustained growth and productivity gains. And actually, there's a lot of work on that. But just for example, Paul Krugman in 1987 has a very interesting paper. The title is way too long for me to repeat it here, but basically the idea is to say, because of learning by doing, you could have some justification for basically infant industry. If, for example, in the service sector, you have low productivity gain compared to manufacturing, then there is a rationale for, pushing basically resources toward manufacturing or industries where you have more productivity gains. So what we did with Fuad is we tried to distill the main lessons, right, from the Asian miracles, and we kind of summarize them in three simple principles. We call this TIP, True Industrial Policy, and we basically argue that this kind of differentiates the Asian miracles or successful industrial policies from many other attempts, which largely led to failures. So the first principle is intervention to create new capabilities in sophisticated industries. In other words, what we're saying is that the first principle is that these economies intervene. So there's the idea of state intervention, because as I said, if you just rely on the standard recipe, the state should not, target specific sector or specific capabilities. In contrast, all of the major miracles actually did active policies to stir, basically to push resources into specific sectors. And the common pattern is that these sectors were actually technologically sophisticated and they were tradable. The second very strong commonality also mentioned and noticed by many others before is the importance of export orientation, also called export discipline by George Studwell. So we called it export, export, export. And that's that was a very strong, there was a very strong focus since the onset on export orientation, right? So it is true that many of these economies use tariffs and some protectionist policies, but what differentiates them from other countries, especially in the 70s and 80s, is that since the beginning they pushed their companies to export. Yes, they supported them, but at the same time it was conditional on being competitive on international markets. And then finally, the last point, we called it fierce competition. Basically, in all these economies, companies had to compete, right? Internationally, of course, because they had to export, but very often domestically. And there was an importance of strict accountability. And I have to say that the support was not unidimensional. I know that a lot of people kind of conflate industrial policy with subsidies or tariff, but it's actually much more multidimensional. The support came in the form of licenses for technologies, came in the form of special public research institutes, specific industries. But if I have to sum it up, what really happened in the Asian miracles is that they focused on specific sectors, but then they made sure that all the ingredients of success were present. And then if you contrast this with the standard recipe where, you build the infrastructure, but there's no real industrial kind of strategy behind it, it also kind of assumes that all the infrastructure are the same. Well, you may miss opportunities. And more important, you wouldn't put together all these public good and quasi-public good that are necessary for success. For example, an infrastructure that's important to export, for example, electronic, could be very different from, exporting steel or other products. No? So maybe you need just an airport instead of a deep sea port. And that's, I think, a key element of a successful industrial policy, this coordination aspect. So I talked about sophisticated industries, and I guess the question is, what is it? And the way we summarize it is basically industries that have high R&D intensity. In other words, R&D spending as a share of sales. So here, this is based on US data. And what you can see is that the height of the bar represent the R&D intensity of different industries. What you can see is a very high dispersion. In other words, few sectors have very high R&D intensity, and most of the others have very low R&D intensity. And lo and behold, the sectors with higher R&D intensity are exactly the ones where the Asian miracles focused their efforts. And it's kind of logical from an economic perspective. With high R&D intensity, right? More innovation, you get more innovation, more productivity gains. And these sectors are pretty much computer, electronic, pharmaceutical, transportation, IT, motor vehicle. And if you contrast this sector with the other sector with low R&D, it becomes very clear that strategies that focus, for example, on trade, finance, or agriculture are kind of doomed in a sense because, I mean, their R&D intensity is low, which means they will relatively quickly kind of hit a plateau where their R&D and where their productivity gains will be relatively low. So I'll just finish before I pass it on to Fuad, with kind of fault lines in terms of interpretation of, what's a good industrial policy or bad one, or more precisely fault lines in terms of applied strategies. So what we're emphasizing is export orientation, and many, I would say, development or growth strategy actually a bit oblivious to that, and they end up encouraging actually non-tradable investment. And some of them directly encourage import substitution, and we claim that's actually not the right way because the Asian makers basically focused on export, but also there's a host of reasons why export is important. It gives an adequate market signal. It makes sure the industries are sustainable, they're competitive. The second kind of distinction is between focusing on developing domestic capability versus basically simple portfolio diversification. This is true mostly for oil exporters, right? And in the book I mentioned earlier with Fuad, we discussed the example of Norway. So Norway is an oil exporter, but Norway is one of the few exporters that developed a service sector around oil. And we kind of go to the genesis of the sector and we uncover very strong state intervention to actually produce the service sector. And I guess their emphasis was domestic capabilities. The third point is sophistication versus low sophistication. As I mentioned, if you focus on agricultural services, such as tourism and finance, these activities are the same. They don't change in time. So basically, you won't have productivity gains. And going back to the idea of Lucas in making a miracle, what drives growth is to continuously enter a new task and then gain productivity there. And then the final point is going beyond comparative advantage. To mention the example, few countries that focus on their comparative advantage, such as Chile, which did really well, but at the same time, if you want to go beyond, for example, escape the middle income trap, most likely the correct strategy would be to go way beyond the comparative advantage, which is a theory, not the theory. Yeah, we know that, for example, if the Koreans believed in comparative advantage, they would have never gone into electronics or sophisticated sector, because back in the 60s and 70s, as emphasized by people like Hadron Chang, they were exporting mostly rice and human hair wigs, and you can imagine what they would be if they followed basically their comparative advantage. So I'll leave it to Fuad now.
All right, great. Thank you, Reda. Thank you all. Great to be here, at least virtually. So I guess, as Reda has mentioned, competition is one of the key principles of industrial policy. And so they don't have to be kind of in contradiction to each other. So it's actually very important to have competition. And exports, in a way, gives you this global competition, right? Especially if the country is a small, open economy. So this kind of an example of the essentially protected market, which is Malaysia, the Proton's car, and the open market, which was Hyundai, kind of an outward-looking market, which was Korea's Hyundai. And you can see actually the strategies pursued by these two companies and two countries essentially were quite different. So Malaysia, was mostly inward looking. They didn't produce a lot of cars. At some point, they tried to export, and they did manage to produce about 500,000 cars per year, but it was not sustained, and it essentially collapsed after a while. The car still exists today. I think it was bought recently by Geely. But there were a lot of problems with it, and lack of innovation, kind of mismanagement. And I think important part of that was that they never even managed to produce their own engine. Now, Hyundai actually had a very different strategy. Yes, the market was protected, but at the same time, they were very much encouraged and even forced to export. And so it was their strategy from the beginning, kind of trying different things, experimenting, learning, and adjusting the strategy accordingly, right? So they would, of course, the US was their ultimate market, kind of the high-income country, huge market, but wasn't easy to penetrate it from the beginning. So they were going through kind of smaller countries first, regional, Canada, and of course, eventually the US. And they were essentially looking at, how do we penetrate this market? They've created their own dealership network. And so a lot of investment went there into advertisement, trying to create a brand, essentially. But the brand, of course, not enough. You have to justify it and substantiate it with the good product. And they spent a lot of money on R&D. They started producing their own engine, which was important because they could start reaping economies of scale and cost efficiencies and so on, right? And that was coming with a huge state support from the state, different types of instruments, but they were not kind of unconditional instruments. So there was strict accountability, as we call it. So there were strings attached to all the conditions given, and these were mainly export market share. So they had to export, they had to compete in global markets, but they also had to compete domestically. So despite the domestic protection, many of these large firms, chaebols, had to compete domestically. Like even Samsung had a car company at some point, right? Eventually, of course, Hyundai, Kia, and and then before the Asian crisis, Daewoo they were there, but at the end of the day, we ended up with a few companies, but the beginning had actually a lot of companies competing against each other domestically and on foreign soil as well. So competition was very important, and kind of outward orientation, export orientation was very important. Now, but competition is not enough. You have to think about the target sectors as well. And I think good example here is Malaysia has done relatively well. They had multinationals, sophisticated sectors like electronics, but they were mostly driven by FDI, and they were not the products produced by domestic companies, unlike Korea. And it starts showing up essentially in the 80s, 90s, when Korea started taking over Malaysia. And you can see here on this chart, essentially the patents filed in the US by these countries, and you can see how Korea started overtaking Malaysia and Chile over time. So it's not even comparable, in the recent years. The argument that we make is not just the sophisticated sectors, it's not just global orientation, export orientation, but it's also who produces the products. So domestic firms become very important in this whole regard in terms of driving growth, especially from middle income to high income, because this growth is driven through innovation, R&D spending, patents, and then, of course, the spillovers to the rest of the economy. And so technology creation is key, and multinationals don't give enough spillovers or don't produce enough spillovers that you would want. Now, in a way, if you kind of think about the R&D, right? If it's innovation that is also important, then who does innovation, who does R&D? So this chart kind of essentially gives you this snapshot of who does it. And so what are the right sectors, right? And you can see here, so it's like Finland, Korea, the median OECD, which is blue, and you can see that in terms of business R&D spending, and essentially what you see is that high-tech manufacturing firms, large firms, mostly non-resource based manufacturing, so it's essentially sophisticated sectors, and it's domestic firms, right? So it's not multinationals, really. They do R&D spending, but not enough. So it's large domestic firms in high-tech manufacturing, right, in sophisticated sectors that mostly do R&D, and that's essentially that would produce innovation, and that's essentially that would drive growth in the long run. Right? Now, so if we kind of give you a couple of examples of how the innovation happened, and that was also driven to a large extent by the state. So here's the example from electronics industry in Taiwan, and kind of the idea is, this is kind of the standard story in economics that, well, SMEs, we want to focus on SMEs, but it's not really SMEs per se. It's really about startups and tech firms, young firms who become big, right? And TSMC is a great example of that. So, and then of course the linkages, you can think of Mittelstand type of firms in Germany, Austria, in Europe. But it all comes back to kind of young firms growing big, or the large firms essentially driving innovation growth. And here the story is that TSMC was essentially born as a spin-off from the Public Research Institute in Taiwan. And that's kind of Industrial Technology Research Institute, ITRI, set up in the 70s to lead the effort, right? From the early age, there was huge investment in different types of bottlenecks, skills, infrastructure, and so on. There was a whole batch sometimes of the whole engineering graduates would be sent to the US, to the Silicon Valley area, to study electronics and electrical engineering, computer engineering. They were all kind of concentrated there. Not many would come back, and eventually many of these guys would come back with contracts, experience, skills, kind of creating the rise of the electronics cluster in Taiwan. And that was important. So the state had a huge role to play in the kind of the beginnings of TSMC. Now, the second example is kind of the interesting case of Nokia, which probably many wouldn't know that Nokia, of course, was a paper mill company and became an mobile phone company later on. And that was driven to a large extent again by the state procurement when they wanted to have some sort of mobile phone in different parts of the country, and especially it was helpful for the post office operator. So that was kind of commissioned by them, and the whole industry, kind of the whole process of inventing and innovating began. And Nokia essentially stumbled upon it and invested in it and spent a lot of time, and eventually they managed to produce the phone, and we know the story. It has a lot of parallels with Taiwan in terms of kind of advisory council, the Public Research Institute (PTT) and TECES, and kind of the financing done by the states, and even big chunk of financing, close to 8% of R&D for years was done through the public research institutes and other financing schemes from the state. And Nokia's R&D was actually quite huge, 1/3 of total R&D in the country, and at some point close to 1% of GDP. So was very important company in Finland. And we have a paper coming up, hopefully showing that that actually Finland hasn't recovered much from the loss of Nokia, at least in the form that it had. Another example that relates to kind of the importance of innovation, some of the tools, is university-centered innovation. EPFL in Switzerland, kind of the Federal Technical Institute in Lausanne, also was important, and of course its twin in Zurich, ETH Zurich. They play an important role in driving innovation. Switzerland, there were a lot of things done, kind of Swiss National Foundation, kind of giving grants, Commission for Technology and Innovation that would support the collaboration with industries, universities, startups around the universities. So there was whole innovation chain created around industries and universities that created startups, patents, a lot of course skills were there to attract foreign talent. So a big chunk of professors, PhD students are foreigners. And that created the right environment to produce startups and patents and other type of innovation. And of course, firms would also be part of it through these innovation parks, and startups growing big, and large firms also trying to acquire smaller firms. So there was the whole system in place. And once the universities created this environment for professors and others to engage in innovation, that was the legal changes made in the 90s, which was similar to the US when of course patents could be also filed, and intellectual property could be held by firms and professors, right, rather than by the university. So it was essentially given the right incentives to innovate. So this was also important to another tool kind of pushing innovation, fostering innovation. Now, if we think about kind of how do we venture into this sophisticated sector, so given these couple of examples, what we can kind of come up with some overall kind of policy, strategy, recommendation based on these experiences. So for the firms and for the workers, how do we align incentives? How do we change incentives so that we go toward these sophisticated sectors? And it's not just multinationals, but it's also domestically driven, right? To jump over the middle income trap, or kind of go through the middle income trap toward the high income status. And here we're talking about kind of the purpose-specific investments in skills and infrastructure. So there is this focus on the right sectors, and then the focus on what do we need to alleviate the constraints and bottlenecks that are out there in those sectors, and how do we kind of focus the investment and financing, and especially given the constraints on resources. And so it becomes important. And all the right business support, whatever is needed, is going to be provided with, of course, strict accountability. So it's not unconditional, right? So the state, the agency in charge of this, has to kind of essentially oversee which firms essentially will survive and which will fall. And in a way, it's going to be done through either it's improvements in innovation indicators like patents, R&D spending, export market shares, improvements in costs, and so on. Right. And for workers, essentially about skills. It's not just education, different types of education, vocational, apprenticeships, early childhood, right? Teacher courses, the whole system that focuses on the right skills, especially given the right sectors that were chosen or decided upon, and also social attitudes. How do we think about kind of the right incentives to take risk, entrepreneurship for low-income countries? How we think about development programs, and this is one of the programs we list here, Saimo Undong, Korean program that essentially help the low-income or kind of rural workers in rural Korea in the 60s, 70s to acquire skills, build roads, and so on. And that would definitely help as well. To summarize, essentially, what we're saying that it's not about picking winners, right? It's about creating winners, kind of the Sanjay Lal development economist, late development economist at Oxford kind of said. So how do you create winners? Well, it's about exporting activities, right, of domestic firms and homegrown technology creation. So it's about creating technology by domestic firms with the kind of outward orientation, export orientation, looking at the global market. So it's not really protectionism. This tool was used in the past, but in today's world, actually, other tools would be more useful and realistic. It's not about picking firms. It's really about sectors. Marianne Mazzucato talks about missions, which also come down to the different types of sectors that you have to decide on. And it's about competition and this kind of churning, right? Creative destruction, Schumpeterian creative destruction that Ahion and Howitt talked about in their work. So the three principles that Reda has mentioned, it's about competition domestically and globally, focusing on technology, moving onto these sophisticated sectors early on. You don't have to wait. Actually, you don't want to wait until you're advanced, because that's how you become advanced. Enforcing market discipline and accountability, that would get you there. And to do that, you have to focus your investments on the right skills, right infrastructure, align incentives for firms, workers, try to change the mindsets, right, of policymakers and firms and workers. So actually focus on this one key objective, how you go from low-income country to developed country for many developing countries in the world, or for advanced countries, how you improve or grow, foster innovation, and grow the technological frontier. And also inclusive growth. It's all really connected. And to some, this quote, I guess, by Albert Hirschman, the principle, from the principle of the hiding hand, says that all this stuff is hard. As Land Pritchett would say, wicked hard. And, to do that, you have to kind of jump into it. And once you jump into it, you start fixing all the potential problems that will arise, and the problems will definitely arise, and you solve them going through this. And that's essentially what this quote is about. Creativity will be forthcoming. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. That was a really fascinating presentation. And now we're going to, And now we're going to hear from James Galbraith for the next 30 minutes. And then after that, we'll have 30 minutes for questions and discussion.
Thanks very much. I do not have a PowerPoint, but I do have a paper which was published last week by the Institute for New Economic Thinking. It's entitled Industrial Policy is a Good Idea, but so far we don't have one. The very phrase industrial policy implies or presupposes that there is something unusual or unconventional at issue, something that requires justification. This state of affairs is itself an artifact of the neoliberal era. And that was clear actually in the last presentation in its reference to standard growth policy advice. If one spoke instead of industrialization or industrial development or modernization or maybe just development, it would be immediately clear that such policies are historically normal and indeed ubiquitous. There are general goals for industrial policy: to create jobs, to foster exports, to support competitiveness, whatever that may mean, and the reduction of the trade deficit. And there are more specific goals. And these are three, I think, general types. First, to build and maintain what's called a defense industrial base, or put it in other words, a military industrial complex. Secondly, prestige competition with other countries. This is a case of competition with the Soviet Union after Sputnik in the 1950s and 60s, later competition with Japan in the 70s and 80s, today with China. And third, again, as just presented in the previous presentation, to advance new technologies, of which examples going back to the middle of the last century include nuclear energy, the space race, the internet, and associated communications technologies, and today, renewable energy, which is to say solar panels, windmills, battery storage, and a very peculiar choice of private cars as the preferred form in the United States of electrically powered transportation. Generally speaking, industrial policy is authoritarian. Decisions are taken by planners, and they're aided by engineers and backed by scientists. Thus, the atomic bomb and the space race, thus the Monet plans in post-war France, the Moscow metro or the city of Magnitogorsk, Japan's Shinkansen, and China's recently built high-speed rail network, or for that matter, many elements of what became the internet and the microcircuit. Today, in the United States, the power to take these decisions is diffused. It is held by corporations, by lobbies, it's mediated by Congress. And it's in this light, I think, that one should consider the three main elements of President Biden's industrial policy, the three being the bipartisan infrastructure law, the Inflation Reduction Act, and the CHIPS Act. If these bills were enacted at all is itself quite remarkable. They overrode the austerity lobby, and they withstood accusations of having fostered inflation because of a too great an expenditure bill. And they have evidently contributed to, or at least have not been inconsistent with, a broadly positive macroeconomic performance, which is to say steady growth, low unemployment rate, strong investment in manufacturing, although manufacturing isn't as big a part of the economy as it once was, but still 700,000 new manufacturing jobs, less than some of the more ambitious projections held that might occur, but still better than nothing. And in addition to that, as Jan Hadzius has told us earlier, haven't been inconsistent with this decline in the inflation rate over the last year or so. Against this, so far there have been no results on trade. There is a developing possible backlash on the budget, which may affect the future of important social insurance programs. And there has been far more gain to profits than there have been to wages. The bipartisan infrastructure law is probably the easiest of the three to evaluate because it is familiar, conventional, and diffuse. There are, according to one report, a new book by Fletcher and Fastow, about 7,000 projects in 4,000 communities across the United States. If you believe the press releases of the White House, which are carefully hedged, actually, the number goes up to about 40,000. The priorities in any such endeavor are going to be those of the state and local governments that are choosing and administering the projects. And they include roads and bridges, airports, water and wastewater, waste disposal, some efforts on broadband, some efforts on the electrical grid, and some protections for steel, perhaps among other things. Apart from a tunnel under the Hudson and another one under the Baltimore Harbor, big bridge in Cincinnati, there don't appear to be very many signature projects in this particular piece of legislation. And the major benefits from an economic standpoint, they're certainly not going to industry. They're going to real estate developers. They will be making improvements and generally speaking in the quality of life in some respects, but there's very little that's specifically industrial or related to competitiveness or trade. The Inflation Reduction Act major target is growth of renewable energy and electric vehicles. The major method is tax credits and tax rebates. Other parts of the law address health care and drug prices. These are not elements of an industrial policy as such. Advocates have claimed that there will be 83 new manufacturing plants so far and up to 170 that are either new or expanded. However, in this area, there are important challenges. One of them is that a decentralized power grid requires far more transmission lines than we actually have. And at the rate at which we are producing new transmission lines, it will take a very long time to produce an adequate grid. Intermittent generation from renewable sources is another problem that must be managed, which means eventually large-scale electrical storage, which does not now exist, and the technical prospects for it are unclear. And there are significant problems with acquiring sufficient skilled manpower and equipment, much of that imported as of now, to do the job. What we have on hand and what we're likely to have is far short of the more ambitious requirements to decarbonize the power grid. Moreover, these are low margin, high fixed cost investments, and their profitability is therefore highly vulnerable to the rise in interest rates that the policy the Federal Reserve has been pursuing over the last couple of years. And the profitability of these operations in many respects is now doubtful, and we have been seeing cancellations, which should not come as a surprise to anyone under the circumstances. The environmental benefits, moreover, depend on actually reducing emissions, particularly of carbon dioxide, but the Inflation Reduction Act actually promotes fossil fuels. Otherwise, Joe Manchin would not have supported it. Jevons Law, pronounced by William Stanley Jevons about a century and a half ago, moreover states that new capacity will be additional to and not a replacement for the use of fossil fuels. That law has so far not been repealed, neither in the United States nor globally. Emissions from the fossil fuel sector continue to rise. So there's a real question of whether capacity added to renewables simply expands the use of energy rather than acting effectively to substitute for fossil fuels. Electric vehicles face their own challenges. There have been last year massive losses, for example, at Ford Motor Company. There's discounting and now layoffs at Tesla. Hertz has abandoned electric vehicles for rentals, and the fact that China now has fully automated factories that can turn out low-cost electric vehicles every 16 seconds, according to one report that I've seen, suggests that if the U.S. version of this industry survives, it is unlikely to conquer world markets. Okay, let me turn to the third thing, which is the CHIPS Act, which has indeed spurred new investment in semiconductors in the United States, notably the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation's efforts to build substantial fabs in Arizona, an enterprise which has already encountered a certain number of difficulties, which have been widely reported in getting the appropriate labor and getting the things up and running. Beyond that, the broad challenge of delinking semiconductors from China has to somehow confront the global nature of that industry, including China's control over the precursor materials, key precursor materials such as germanium and gallium, China's capacity to advance in chip design and lithography, which has already, I think, proven surprising to those who had doubts about whether, for example, Huawei would survive the effort to cut it off from advanced chips, and the fact that China provides half the world market for the end product, a point that was already made in the White House report on the supply chain back in 2021. Meeting any or all of these challenges requires, as a very first and preliminary condition, spending out the $52 billion allocated by the CHIPS Act so far. According to the last reports that I've seen, only a fraction of that has actually been allocated or spent. So there's a question of to what extent the policy is actually moving along and being put into effect in a serious way. And the process of allocating funds under the Act has been challenged by Senator Elizabeth Warren and Representative Pramila Jayapal for having been delegated to financiers drawn from Wall Street firms. There are, I think, two rather larger and deeper problems. The first is that the enduring, for now, financial hegemony of the United States in the world economy, which is a product of an earlier period of industrial, technical, and military strength, is incompatible with sustained industrial recovery and advance in the world economy. The contest between industry and finance, between profits and rents, is not a new thing. It's a very old thing. It goes back to the Corn Laws, at least in the 19th century. There's debates in 19th century Britain over tariffs on food. But fundamentally, you cannot, on a sustained basis, be dominant both in industrial competitiveness and profitability and in financial rents. So if the U.S. were serious about industrial renewal, it would have to make fundamental choices about the structure of the economy, fundamental choices that would, to a large extent, work to reverse over time and with very significant effort the changes that have occurred since the late 1970s, early 1980s. But these are choices in political economy about which the United States is fundamentally and evidently not serious. Rather, it is play acting because it's clear that the larger thrust of American policy is to maintain its financial hegemony for the obvious reasons. That's where the source of power in the American political economy is at the present time. So this is a big issue, and it's an issue which is familiar to any country which has ever suffered from Dutch disease. You have one source of rents that's holding up the value of your currency and your position in the world economy. Good luck building a strong industrial base which will be able to forge ahead and be highly competitive on world markets. It's very hard to think of examples of this having happened in the past. But there's a second deep problem, and it's really more of a conceptual problem, and I'll close on this note, and that is the erosion of the technical capacity in the United States over the 40 years of financialization, along with what really has to be considered the fairly deliberate and systematic elimination of scientific and technical expertise as an autonomous capacity for evaluation inside the government of the United States. It's been going on for a long time, and it's been going on both in the executive branch and the Congress. The elimination of the Office of Technology Assessment in the early 1990s in the Gingrich Revolution, just one example. You can find it practically throughout the United States government. We have advocates for industrial policy, presently still very prominent, whose belief in this approach dates back to the 1970s. At that time, the capacity still existed to implement and evaluate such policies, or at least the memory of a time when the United States government had that capacity was relatively fresh. The era of Ronald Reagan and Paul Volcker, which launched the rise of the dollar and the collapse of the industrial base in the United States, dealt a very severe blow to the technical capacity, engineering capacity, the skilled workforce that is required to have an effective industrial policy. The subsequent period under President Clinton, under Speaker Gingrich, under Chairman Greenspan, the neoliberal era of the 1990s, enshrined a practice of neoliberal mismanagement of the larger economy. And a quarter century has passed since then with no significant reversal. So it is a rather sad irony, in my view, that the concept of industrial policy has come back into fashion in the United States, perhaps 30 or even 50 years since the capacity to do a proper job began to decline. I'm not saying that there are no good things in the Biden bills. I think a lot of good things will, in fact, happen. It will be better than not having them happen. It's certainly better to have the infrastructure renewed. It's certainly better to get some factories and some capacity going. And I'm not saying it won't necessarily have a political effect, but if it has a political effect coming up this fall, it will be because of the narrative rather than because of concrete results out of the fruits of an effective and successful policy. So thank you very much.
Thank you for these fascinating presentations. We now have time for questions. I am happy to take questions. There's a Q&A feature here in Zoom. People can pose questions. I'm going to have you use my sort of moderator's discretion here to ask the first one. I wonder if we can get some engagement here between the two presentations, because obviously very different perspectives. I'm wondering if it'd be helpful to maybe think about, to the extent that, from Reda and Fuad, the perspective is very much on industrial policy as a way to improve economic outcomes. It was really about improving efficiency and improving a way, as a development strategy. Whereas James's presentation was about that as one part of it, but also there are other reasons why you might want to have an industrial policy, whether it's for national security or prestige or what have you. And I'm wondering maybe if we could engage a little bit about areas where there might be some overlap and things where, in particular, if you're what might apply for either poor countries versus richer countries that maybe have some similar goals, and also whether how much market size might also affect domestic market size might potentially affect the strategies. Thank you.
Okay, I can offer can I jump in on that?
Absolutely.
Sure. One of the things in the first presentation that's very interesting was that showing a familiar showing that 70 or 80 years ago, Korea and Ghana had similar levels of per capita income. Obviously, that's not the situation today. Well, why not? Well, I think a key reason is Korea was and is a frontline state, and Ghana was not and is not. And so Korea launched on a policy which was closely tied to its national military situation, to its national defense. It launched on something called the Heavy and Chemical Initiative in the middle 1970s. Why did it do that? Because the U.S. was leaving Vietnam. And there was complete uncertainty in the Korean government, which was at that time a military government, as to whether the U.S. would continue to support South Korea's political independence and its defense from the obvious threat that it faces from the North. What was the essence of that? This was dual-use industrialization, chemical and metals and equipment. Hyundai Heavy Industries emerges from that. What was their first product? It was a tank. It's a knockoff of the M1 tank. Then they went down into the vehicles and so forth that we know them for today. So these are intimately tied. Why was Korea permitted to do this? Well, because from the United States standpoint, they got their industry up and running, they would be taking care of some of that burden. We wouldn't have to do it. And so, part of the deal was that Korea got access to American markets. And in the 1980s, in the early part of the debt crisis, Korea was not cut off from financing the way Latin America and Africa and other places that were not frontline states were. So there is the same is true for Taiwan, by the way. Absolutely, the same is true. This because it's a frontline state. It had special dispensations. So true of Japan earlier that other countries didn't have. They had market access. It had the ability to take on major advanced industries and build them up in a way which was their civilian industry and their military interests were complementary. So that's, I think, something one has to bear in mind, that an industrial strategy has always had a strong military component. And that's, of course, what's going on now with respect to the semiconductor initiative and artificial intelligence and other things that the United States security establishment wants to maintain in the United States or build in the United States so that it's not under Chinese control.
Yes, Reda, feel free to jump in. Sorry.
Yeah, just to add, well, it's a pleasure, to be with Professor Galbraith. Thanks, great presentation. And yes, absolutely true. Just to add kind of one point, so another kind of dimension to this, importance of these industries that had dual use. There was also a sense of vulnerability. So basically, Park Chung-hee, the Korean general who was behind the coup in the 60s and then started all this kind of development of heavy industries and then led to electronics. He actually wrote a book to explain, why, he changed the economic policy of Korea. So it happened that in the 60s, actually, Kennedy basically cut the aid to the Koreans, right? Which was at that time about half their budget. And he explicitly writes in this book that, well, we're very vulnerable. We depend on this aid. It was cut. We have to do something about it. And what's interesting, and was striking in Professor Galbraith's presentation is that he mentions Dutch disease. And you can think about it as a reverse Dutch disease, right? They lost this kind of hard currency, this income, and they had to find replacement. And that's why they developed these export-oriented industries. But then they were very strategic in what they want. And absolutely, there were overlaps. But I guess in today's world, you mentioned what poor countries can do. So it's not, I guess it's not necessarily, they don't have to go or follow the same path, but really the same idea, sophisticated industries with high, how to say, income elasticity, right? You don't want economies to fall into, the Prebish kind of trap, right? That, they go into commodities and then they get stuck. So yeah, so that's, there are different reasons, I guess, different paths.
So this is a perfect segue into the next question that's actually from the audience here, which is, speaking of Dutch disease and how the opportunities and pitfalls there. I'm gonna say this question's for both of you. If the U.S. dollar were to, and this is the word in the question, dive, would that potentially help? How would that interact with any efforts to develop a U.S. or redevelop a U.S. Industrial base? Feel free for both to take a stab.
I'll defer to the IMF on that one first, and then I'll come back with my thoughts on it.
All right, maybe I can try, but of course it's my view rather than the IMF's view on the question. Well, if the US dollar were to dive, US is pretty sophisticated economy, so in theory it should help its exports and development path trajectory in terms of developing and selling globally. The question, of course, becomes, all these other tools that were announced with IRA and, the tools that already exist, how it would help the kind of re-industrialization of the US, especially of the Midwest, kind of the where we saw a lot of deindustrialization happen recently. So it becomes important to kind of focus efforts on driving growth through, now the question will be, is it manufacturing, is it services? But it has to kind of be, one has to think definitely about the inclusion component of it, and one has to think about, the growth component of it. And I think there was a paper we did before with Philippe Aguillon trying to kind of argue that, well, inclusive component of it, inclusive growth is also going to be driven, kind of improved upon if one engages in industrial policy, essentially kind of manufacturing, high-tech manufacturing, advanced manufacturing, because it does provide higher wages and a lot of positive spillovers to the rest of the economy. So a lot of linkages, spillovers, supply chain linkages, and so on. So positive externalities in a way. So in that sense, that should help. All these tradable industries should benefit. But you'd also have to think about these other components that, exchange rate is not the only tool. You have to think about other elements to alleviate these market failures that exist.
I want to follow up on this because I know one of the papers. Oh, sorry. My fault.
I'll hop in on this at this point because I had a few seconds to reflect on my answer. And I'll start with a parallel case, which is the case of the Russian Federation, where in 1998, the ruble collapsed. And as a result of that, very quickly, industrial activity began to revive, and it has been reviving and growing stronger over the subsequent 20, 25 years, in spite of the sanctions, and that's another story, but in spite of the sanctions, perhaps because in part of the sanctions. But in any event, after only 10 years or so after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Russian industrial capacity was still existing. It had not been shipped out to other countries. And reviving it was largely a question of the change in relative prices that made it advantageous to bring a lot of it back into use over time and then to improve it. The United States case is a little different in that we have been pursuing a strategy of financialization and deindustrialization for 40 years, at least, since the early 1980s. And we've lost a lot of the technical capacity. The equipment is gone. It's not going to be, it would have to be entirely renewed. And we have lost, as I said before, the capacity in the state to actually lead and guide that policy. So we've outsourced it to corporations, which see the opportunity to take advantage of tax subsidies that are not necessarily connected to their ultimate ability to deliver the results. They may or they may not, but there's no monitoring that will ensure that they do. So my view is that the crisis in the United States would have to be considerably deeper than a simple collapse of the currency. You really have to undo the heavy weight of the financial rentier sector on the economy, and you have to reconstruct the underlying technical capacity. You can't just import people from people from Asia are no longer going to come because they have strong career possibilities in their technical fields in their home countries. We've been relying on that for an awfully long time. So I think that we would face very severe adjustment difficulties that would carry us quite a long time before we got back into a position where the industrial base of the United States would begin to be restored in an effective way. And you have to ask about the question of the underlying availability of resources. The Russian Federation has them in abundance. In the United States, well, it's not as bad as Europe, which is deindustrializing heavily based on the very high cost of resources. But it's not as favorable, certainly, a position as it was a century ago or half a century ago. So I think really thinking these things through My conclusion is that we are probably going to face a much more severe adjustment problem as a result of the fact that we have been conducting a policy of essentially putting the financial sector in the first place in our economy since the late 1970s and the early 1980s, and leaving everything else to its own devices. So what we have is an economy of finance, real estate, as Christopher Whalen explained very carefully earlier this morning, and the services sector, with a greatly diminished capacity to manage the large industrial processes that are the core of the kind of thing that we're talking about here.
So just a reminder for everyone who's listening and watching that if you want to ask a question, there's a Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom, and if you can type that in, I will get to that. Seeing none at the moment, I want to follow up on this discussion though, which is I know Reda and Fuad, you've written, and you mentioned briefly in your presentation, and you've written about how commodity exporters, particularly oil exporters, might think about using industrial policy to diversify, because this is very related to this subject. In particular, I mean, I don't know exactly if James would agree with me on this, but I think part of the deindustrialization and financialization of the U.S. actually is related to what one might have thought of as his own kind of Dutch disease with a potentially overvalued dollar. At least there's a lot, the appeal of U.S. assets for foreign investors, making American industry less competitive. You can argue that's true for oil exporters as well, especially ones that try to peg their currency. Wages in the Gulf states are extraordinarily high, unless except for people who are brought in sort of under set, but for locals anyway, the wages are for citizens, the wages are very high. Norway had a very interesting kind of different approach to that. That's distinctive and, as you mentioned, successful. I'm wondering if you kind of maybe give us some more color on how what are the things that governments in places that might potentially suffer from these kind of misallocations, or not misallocations, but external pressures do in order to maintain kind of a diversified economy at the technological frontier.
Maybe I'll jump in if you don't mind, because basically the differential in terms of the kind of the intensity of the Dutch disease between countries, that was basically the subject of my thesis, PhD thesis. But so the key kind of let's say factor is the distance to the technological frontier. So in other words, why is it that Nigeria would suffer much more than Norway from the Dutch disease? Because initially, they're further from the technological frontier, and you can think of it as kind of the implicit real exchange rate appreciating much more than in Norway, right? So that you don't see a deindustrialization, but basically.
Sorry, if I could just jump in very briefly. I mean, I completely understand your point there, but Norway was for Western Europe quite poor in like 1960 and before they discovered oil, and they're also, I mean, now they have like over $1 trillion in oil wells. I'm just curious, I mean, obviously that's important. I just want to kind of maybe get more.
No, it's true, but what I meant is they were much richer than Nigeria, let's say, and much more technologically, I mean, kind of closer to the frontier. However, maybe that's where you're going to. What is it that we uncovered in our paper with Fuad about Norway is that they had very active policies to encourage a very sophisticated sector around the kind of oil production. So, and basically, if you look at the examples of many, and you rightly point to the fact that Norway was not, the richest economy when they discovered oil. And however, we know that in terms of, submarine technology, pipelines, geological surveys, they're among the best. If you dig kind of deeper, what happened is that in the 70s and 80s, they basically imposed on all multinationals to do 50% of their R&D in Norway. They actually intervened in the procurement, right? They basically decided who wins the tender. So they pushed their companies there. So these were very activist policies. And of course, the companies at some point became competitive, but they learned a lot, and then they started exporting themselves. So I guess the point is not to say that they have to do exactly the same, right, in the oil sector, but I guess the implication is that for developing economies is this emphasis on catching up in terms of capabilities It could be around existing sectors. It could be beyond in something new. But one of the tools they can use is if they have rents, use these rents to not, and by the way, subsidies are not necessarily the best tools, but really support, right? Public Research Institute, coordinating all these tools to help those sectors. It's interesting because if you look at the tools, at least the external tools of industrial policy, which is, you can think of, I don't know, national development banks, SEZs, you name it, right? Public Research Institutes. Most economies have them, and yet they don't work because they're not coordinated toward like few targets, and also perhaps they lack in terms of scale and focus. So yeah, that's in a nutshell what I think they could do.
Well, I'll just add to that the country after which Dutch disease is named is actually Holland, which is a high-income country. It was the discovery of natural gas that brought on this phenomenon of effective deindustrialization. Norway is a country of 2 million people with very large fossil fuel reserves. Nigeria is a country with 250, 240 million people, and in a very different geopolitical situation from Norway. So I don't think one can say that Nigeria's problems are strictly speaking just because of its overvaluation of its currency, whereas that's, I mean, it has to do with the fact that its resources are exploited not for the benefit of the Nigerian people, and many other issues related to that. But then the question then comes back to the United States, which is, for whose benefit have the resources of the United States been exploited over the past, again, the past 40 years? And the answer to that is, first of all, it's obvious from the growth of an extremely small elite in the finance and technology sectors, that the outsized proportion of the exploitation to the benefit of that group. And secondly, the broad real wage of the American public is held up by the value of the dollar through the access to cheap resources and cheap imports. And again, so there's not an easy exit from this situation, but it would have to begin by trimming back on the extraordinary holdings of the elite and creating a structure which has a broader public purpose to it. And this is what has been missing. And the question is whether the Biden strategy really meets that requirement. And my answer, after you look at the pieces, is that while there's some useful things that are being done, I have no objection to spending money at the state and local level on infrastructure projects that are needed. But that this is, when you get down to the parts that really affect industry as such, the evidence so far is not persuasive that they will yield the kinds of results that advocates of industrial policy typically advances the purposes of the policy. That's the issue in my mind.
Thank you. I'm going to take some more questions to the audience now. So I have one here, which is a nice follow-up to this, which is, what are the views on how institutions in different jurisdictions affect the implementation of industrial policy successfully or not? I mean, we look at different examples here. I mean, we can say, why is it that Norway became a major exporter of services and technology related to oil exploration in a way that, for example, the Gulf states have not? Or why is it that Korea actually made the choices it did relative to, say, Malaysia? Or related to James's last point, like to the extent that the U.S. is trying something now, if it works or not. I mean, what is sort of the underlying drivers here that affect some of these things? Thank you.
Maybe I can jump in. So I mean, of course, if you look across the spectrum of how industrial policy was conducted, or kind of something of similar sort, it differs, across countries, given different institutional structure. But if you look at East Asia, for example, in general, what you had was some sort of agency, whether it was MITI in Japan or Economic Development Board, EDB, in Singapore, or of similar institutes or agencies in Korea and Taiwan, what you see is that you had actually big push toward or big focus toward these sophisticated sectors, trying to develop them and applying different types of tools to make sure the sector develops. So even before the institutional arrangement kind of came into place, probably what was important was the idea or kind of the mindset, right? This developmental mindset, as Robert Wade would call it. So you need to have this right mindset on the part of policymakers to decide on what we're really trying to achieve here. And for many East Asian countries was, well, we want to be, we want to achieve advanced country status, we want to be high income, we want to improve standards of living. And that was key. And then these agencies essentially were tasked with this major goal, and everything was focused on that goal. And then, of course, the right policies were in place, and it's not like they were not they were always successful from the get-go, but they would fail, stumble, adjust, adapt, and kind of move ahead. So they would always keep moving forward, and I think that was an important element. So you still can have kind of failures along the way, but again, back to like production, learning by doing. You learn by doing, and you improve, and eventually you succeed.
Let me hop in on that as well. I mean, Korea, for example, the same was true of Japan earlier, maintained capital controls. It had very substantial taxes on luxury imports to control the consumption of its elites. It had a close cooperation between large industrial combines, the chaebol and the keiretsu and so forth, and the government. And all of these things came together in the development of an industrial strategy. But one wants to talk about the really big, the big case here. We have to talk about China. And what China did, I think, is very poorly understood and largely distorted in American political discourse. The most important thing made it possible for China to emerge as a leading industrial policy and power in the world, is that for 7 decades, it's been a country at peace with the capacity to continue to develop itself internally. This is a hugely important thing. It's a country which also maintained a distinct autonomy of its distinct financial independence from the rest of the world, and maintained capital controls. I'd like to report that when I was Chief Technical Advisor to the State Planning Commission of the People's Republic of China in the 1990s, I organized a conference outside of Beijing for the monetary policymakers. I invited Robert Eisner and Jane DeRisto. Jane, by the way, has just published a memoir. I recommend it, to Beijing to speak to them. And I made it a condition that they argue against relaxation of capital controls, which they did. And I won't claim credit for what the Chinese government does, but the Chinese government did not relax capital controls, was not caught up in the Asian crisis in 1997, whereas Korea, which had liberalized under American pressure, was caught up in that, as was Indonesia and all the other countries, Thailand, that suffered severe reverses in the late 1990s. China did not. So the process of cumulative causation and cumulative development continued in China with the importation and then the indigenous development of technical capacity, which now leads to be the largest economy, certainly in purchasing power terms, in the world. And one of the most modern.
Thank you. I want to hear from Reda. I know he has his hand up here. So,
thanks. Just to add a few points, as James mentioned earlier, basically what's important for this institution is technical capabilities. We know in these, East Asian economies, these institutions that Fuad mentioned had a lot of technical capabilities, like very good engineers who knew actually the industries. And then we have a forthcoming paper with Fuad where we compare these institutions and we see common features. Another common feature among these agencies is that they had sectoral departments. So they're dedicated department to a sector where you had technical capabilities, people looking at the market, international market, very strong link with you can call export promotion agencies, but they had their own network. And then you had this concept, from Peter Evans of embedded autonomy, right? The sociologist from MIT, where basically describes different countries and how their development agencies, the one that Fuad mentioned, were at the same time kind of autonomous in the sense there was not a lot of intervention from, political intervention, but at the same time they were pretty close to the private sector, right? They worked with them. They were not in an ivory tower. I guess an extreme case is in Japan, where in MITI, the civil servants, when they reached, I think, 55-year-old, they actually went to the private sector, right? They moved from the public to the private sector, what they call the amakudari, right? The descent from heaven, basically.
Right. Thank you. Yeah, I also, I guess, just to follow up on this, and this relates to one of the questions that's here in the queue is, some of the advice that people say works. Obviously, there's a disagreement among all of you, so I'm not gonna say it's all of what you say, but it disagrees with, or at least historically has disagreed with, advice that institutions such as the IMF and other outside experts have given. I'm not going to say that capital controls and high taxes on luxuries are themselves sufficient for development. You see plenty of countries that tried that and then do quite poorly. But until relatively recently, I think it was about 10 years ago, the IMF began changing its views on capital flow management measures. But before that, the consensus was very clearly that these things are counterproductive, and there are reasons for why that was. The extent now, I know that the IMF's sort of house view on industrial policy itself more broadly is shifting. That's part of why the title of this panel is the industrial policy coming back. But there's still, I think, some skepticism for some measures. And I'm curious, including, for example, things like the more sort of explicitly protectionist, to the extent that those things seem to work or not. What is a way for a particularly developing economy that might, need access to some of these institutions, potentially, how should they think about, balancing the priorities of access to international institutions and also development?
I'll just speak to the question of capital controls. And the IMF was born into a world of capital controls in which it was envisaged that they would continue, and they did continue for much of the period of what's called the 30 glorious years of reconstruction and development in Europe and elsewhere in the world, Japan. I don't believe that the IMF charter was ever amended, I might be wrong on this, to preclude capital controls. Obviously, the ideology moved against them from the 1980s onward. But it is entirely within the accepted legal framework for countries to impose and maintain capital controls. And the more successful ones, and the ones that have avoided, have had a better job of avoiding the kind of speculative attacks on their currency, such as affected Thailand or Mexico, or you name it, lots of places, have either maintained or imposed those controls. In fact, they were imposed by the European Union on Greece in 2015. I was there at the time, and the finance ministry had to administer them. They were imposed on Cyprus. So they are an important tool, and they're a completely legitimate tool, despite the fact that there's a whole ideology saying that capital should be as free to move as the trade winds and the ocean currents. There's no basis for believing that.
Maybe I can add a few points. I guess also the evolution of kind of ideas, right? Say by the IMF, other international financial institutions, has to a large extent also been driven by the ideas of economists, right? Economics in general. And in those days, kind of in the 80s and 90s, kind of the ideas of liberalization, free markets kind of was taking hold. And we did this paper with Reda and Mark Enger, former coworker, colleague of ours, on growth narratives, kind of crouching beliefs, hidden biases, no, and looking at the IMF Article 4 reports as kind of the test bed of kind of the evolution of economics ideas over time. And you do see this rise of narrative related to Washington consensus type of policies. And in the fall of this narrative, kind of overtaken by other narratives, which kind of recently become known as structural reforms. So maybe it was some switch or kind of switching toward the structural reforms, but keeping the original ideas of liberalization. And recently, very recently, we start seeing this kind of myriad of different types of terms, distinct terms appearing, knowing how we think about growth policy overall, which we kind of named Washington Constellation. Right? So we have different things happening and discuss at the same time. And if you think about this, the evolution of reforms, ideas is driven by this mainstream kind of evolution of ideas in economics. And it's not surprising that now that we're looking into industrial policy, and of course, the work has been happening also for some time. We've been working on this for more than 10 years now inside the IMF. And so there was this discussion of ideas, but now that these ideas are out there, this, the institution is also changing its views. Kind of, I guess, as Keynes said, when data changes, I change my mind.
Excellent. Reda, if you want to jump in.
Yeah, just to add 2 points. The first, perhaps to remind the audience that Fuad and I are not representing the views of the fund, right? And the second one, I think now that industrial policy is back, a great kind of an important question is, so people are rediscovering the toolbox, let's say, of these Asian miracles, and they used a lot of tools. So what would be very important, or what is important, is to distinguish between tools that were necessary and those that were not. And most important, those that actually could be even thought that those that were not necessary and probably counterproductive in today's world. And I think you mentioned protectionism. So one of our arguments with Fuad in our paper, and I actually a recently issued paper, is that yes, the Asian miracles did use protectionism. They did have tariffs, but at the same time, they're extremely export-oriented. And what we claim is that it may not have been necessary, and at the same time, perhaps in today's world, it could be, or it would be counterproductive. You can still support industries, be internationally competitive without tariffs. And I guess Tesla is a very good example, right? In an open economy, you have a new industry that basically, disrupted old entrenched industries.
Great, thank you. We have one last question. We talked about how expertise shifts in part because people actually move. Whether it's some of the East Asian success stories, you had people go abroad to learn things and then come back, or other countries, people they leave and then they bring the knowledge with them. The question here is, if you're a developing country and you have people who are getting expertise, obviously you don't want to be an authoritarian system that literally prevents people from leaving, but at the same time, if you want to develop the expertise domestically, how do you balance that desire while at the same time, making sure that the talent is retained and you have domestic investments?
Well, again, to take the case of China, it imported a couple of things. It imported a certain amount of technology as part of the requirements for joint investment by foreign firms. I don't think it's the essential thing. A much more important thing in Chinese industrial development was that it basically adopted the standards which were already in place in the West, in the United States, in Europe, for the production of the vast array of consumer goods, which the Chinese themselves would consume. And this greatly upgraded the capacity of Chinese industry to be competitive in the world markets on a lot of things. This was a problem that socialist economies did not previously solve, and the Chinese solved it that way. And you can just see this has been very visible in just daily life in China. So then there's the question of the talent of its citizens, and it has met that challenge by producing talent on a very, very large scale. So there's plenty to spare.
I guess James brought up an important point on skills, right? It's definitely an important component, right? If you want to make industrial policy successful, so no doubt. And I think East Asians understood it well. And I think the example I gave on Taiwan's electronics industry, like the creation of TSMC and their other company, UMC, also one of the largest semiconductor companies in the world. The whole story was that they would send the whole engineering graduates to the US to study. And actually, in the beginning, maybe 10% would come back, right? And this was done on a yearly basis until eventually, the sector was being developed locally, and that started kind of the attraction of all the people who were studying, living, and getting experience in the US, especially. Being interested of going back as well. So it's what's optimal here in terms of should you restrict the flow? Probably not. Should you require students to come back? It's not clear, but maybe also not optimal to require everyone to come back, right? So it's not exactly clear, but definitely letting people go learn and then maybe come back later. That would create opportunities for the industry that you are trying to develop down the line. And I think this is also important.
Great, thank you. And Reda, maybe you can close us out.
Yeah, just to add, link what Fuad said and James, basically the coherence of such strategy and the Taiwanese experience kind of illustrated because they sent thousands of students study electronics in the same place in Silicon Valley, right, over years. And they organized them there to kind of make sure it becomes a network, then linking up with their own cluster in Taiwan there. Yeah, that's it.
Great, thank you, everyone. We are now at time. So that's the end of this session, and we're going to have something else start again soon. Thanks for being here.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.